Thanks, Garrett, and thank you all for having me. This is actually my first time up to Maine, and I intend it to be the first of several visits in the coming years. I'm going to be talking, like Garrett said, about a paper that came out in the last summer, early fall, looking at different approaches to economic development. The paper is really a review of a vast body of research literature on the economic benefits of different approaches to economic development by state and local governments. I'm glad that people read it and show interest in it, but brace yourself before wading into it, because there's a lot of research in all these areas. There's a big body of research on what are the economic benefits of investing in education. There's a big body of research on the economic payoffs of investing in infrastructure, and similarly from pursuing tax incentives as an approach to economic growth. In this presentation, I'll try to boil it down to the few, I think, salient points that really stand out as the main conclusions from dozens and dozens and dozens of research papers in all these areas. And I'm going to start by the outline of the talk will be, I'll start with giving something of an overview of territory that you all in this room are sadly too familiar with, the jobs picture that's confronted Maine over the last few years, and a brief review of the forecast going into the coming years. Then I'll shift gears a little bit and talk about not so much the jobs picture of the Great Recession and its aftermath, but some of the more economically oriented factors that I think can serve to highlight the potential role of the public sector at this point in time, at this point in Maine's economic history and trajectory, regardless of the policy or political realities as represented by Mr. Millett and the current governor. And finally, I'll get into the review of that evidence on the payoffs to investing in education, infrastructure, and tax incentives. So the jobs picture, again, sadly familiar to everyone in this room. The Great Recession dealt a huge blow to Maine's economy, eliminating more than 30,000 jobs in Maine. Nationally, the economy between December 2009 and December 2007 and 2009 lost 8.6 million jobs. Since that point in time, we have officially ended the recession. So in July 2009, the recession was officially over, and we have embarked on a period of recovery. That recovery has been feeble and shaky, as the jobs numbers on this current slide suggest. Between December 2010, most recent data available, and December 2009, Maine added approximately 4,000 jobs. Nationally, we added 900,000 jobs. At this rate of economic growth, the average job creation over the last 12 months, it would take Maine nearly 7 years to replace all the jobs lost in the recession. It would take the country nearly 9 years to replace those jobs. And when we look at those who are unemployed now, we see that there are a considerable number of Mainers who are out of work. There are a little more than 50,000 Mainers who are unemployed at present. That has declined slightly from the peak of about 58,000 that was evident over most of 2009 and early 2010. But one thing you should notice, if you squint and glare and stare closely at the details, you'll see that the number of unemployed has fallen about 7,000 since about 6 months ago. But over the whole year, you only added 4,000 jobs. So the gap there is people becoming discouraged, dropping out of the labor market altogether, or potentially even leaving the state. And this, a brief aside at this point, that I hope to return to later and possibly in questions, is that jobs are the most important reason why anyone actually moves. Household dissolution, marriage, those are big drivers, but jobs, getting a new job, losing a job. So if anyone's concerned about attracting people to or retaining people in Maine, jobs really do need to be the number one priority. It's a common myth that taxes matter that much. There's a vast literature on the reasons why people move, and taxes, the role that they play in that literature, barely registers. Jobs are why people move. So, and I think the gap between the decrease in unemployment and the increase in jobs is a little bit of evidence of what you're actually experiencing. So the unemployment scenario presently remains bleak, and it doesn't really promise to turn around anytime soon. This is the forecast, the November consensus forecast for Maine, and the Congressional Budget Office's most recent economic forecast for the nation. Obviously, unemployment is forecast to start declining, and that's obviously a good thing. But one thing I want you to draw your attention to is that unemployment in Maine is not forecast to decline below 6% until 2014. 5 years after this, we left the last recession, so 5 years into an economic recovery, we're expecting unemployment in Maine to remain higher than it was at any point in the last recession. So yes, we are recovering, but that recovery is shaky and it's fairly feeble. And so obviously confronting the horrible straits that Mainers, working Mainers, have found themselves in, unemployed Mainers have found themselves in, and all of the states are asking similar questions. What can be done? Most of the rest of my talk is going to be on this point from two different perspectives, but I'm not going to bind myself by I'm not going to bind myself by the 8 principles that that Governor LePage has given his administration. In part, I'm going to be basing my talks on what the research literature suggests the payoff to different approaches are. Right? So there will be a fundamental distinction between our two remarks, but there are big limitations on the options available to state policymakers in Maine and in every other state. In part, almost every state has, and in fact every state adheres to, even if Vermont doesn't have a constitutional requirement, they do balance their budget. So you have a balanced budget, you can't run big deficits. Right? Also, states just don't have trade policy. They don't make monetary policy. There's no Federal Reserve of the state trying to find ways to make it cheaper for businesses to borrow and invest. And finally, obviously, you all know that you have serious budget shortfalls. So the room you have to pursue new initiatives is extremely limited. And if you opt to go in that direction, it will require new revenues. Right? But despite these limitations, the role of the state remains fundamental, and the prospects are there. Whether or not you choose to pursue them or not is a different matter, but the potential is there. So I want to step back to some real fundamentals of economics. Economics 101. You'll see an accounting identity. This equation, economists love equations, and this is my only equation I'm going to put up for this whole presentation, so don't worry. This is called the national income accounting identity. National income equals the sum total of consumption plus investment plus government plus net imports. So exports minus imports. So what happens in a recession? Regardless of what causes any given recession, and this recession was caused by a massive collapse of financial institutions, a loss of more than $10 trillion in national wealth, and its repercussions on businesses and households. So that was the cause, if you will. But how does that cause filter its way through the economy? This is what happens. Consumption plummets and investment plummets. So when you look at the data on national economic data on consumption, I'm giving you here inflation-adjusted total consumption. That's the black line. And you can see that right as you head into the end of 2007, early 2008, consumption actually declines, stays very low, starts to creep up. What the gray line is to represent the gap, the missing level of consumption. That sort of gives a straight line projection of the historical trajectory of what we would expect consumption levels actually to be, and you can see that we have a shortfall in consumption nationally of about $750 billion. Right? And another thing that happened, so consumption has declined, and it's not simply that everyone has lost income, it's that people have lost confidence. They're scared economically. They're holding on to their money. Businesses are not investing. And households have increased their savings. Especially households able to save are not consuming. They're saving a lot. The national savings rate has rose dramatically upon entry into the Great Recession, rising from close to 2% of personal income, up to 5% of personal income. A lot of people are holding on to money, not spending it, and that's driving down the national economy even further. And this is deeply problematic because when you do surveys of small businesses, and this is a graph produced by the National Federation of Independent Business in their monthly survey of small businesses, what you see is that the number one problem cited by small businesses is sales. There are not enough people coming in the door trying to buy their goods and services. If the lighting were down a little bit, this would be a crisper graph. But on the left-hand side, this black line that spikes is sales. And 30% of small businesses say their number one problem is not enough sales, not enough business, not enough people coming in the door. That's higher than it has been at any point in this survey's history. And that's a big problem. And another aspect of the downturn and the economic reality of this downturn is a dramatic reduction in business investment, right? So this again shows the actual level of business investment. This is real non-residential fixed business investment rising steadily and declining, plummeting actually as we enter the Great Recession. The last couple of quarters you've seen some small increases in investment, but we still have investment lagging about $700 billion off of the pre-recession trajectory. So what we've seen, consumption plummeted, investment plummeted. You can't count on exports and imports because that's at the whim and the will of foreign countries, and they're experiencing global economic problems as well. So the question remains, what is government going to do? Right? The government is an entity, the public sector is an entity that has the possibility of pushing against the business cycle. And I think there's a choice and an option available to state policymakers to feed the business cycle or to fight the business cycle. There's some talk that some people's perspectives on what government should do, I think, take the framework of a household budget or even sort of a moralistic perspective on what a government should do. But for an economist, just looking at the national income and accounting identity, right, if a government decreases its spending, it's feeding the cycle. And for folks concerned about the government crowding out private investment, in an environment with 9.5% unemployment, 75% capacity utilization, and incredibly low interest rates, crowding out is not going to happen here. So the question is, what is the public sector going to do? And the most recent figures that I was able to find on government employment, this is Census Bureau data on full-time equivalent employment, state and local government in Maine. It looks like the Maine public sector has taken a real big dive between 2008 and 2009, a decline of 4,000 full-time equivalent employment jobs for the state and local sector. So if, from this point, what do we think about, or what does the evidence suggest to us if this state, or if any other state, is to pursue an active approach? If instead of fueling the business cycle by hunkering down and belt tightening, if the state is to pursue an active approach to investing in areas that can create jobs and increase economic growth over the long run, what are the options? What is the evidence? I'm going to review two. I'm going to spend my remaining time really focusing on infrastructure and education, and if I have time, a brief comment on tax incentives, and so we'll go from there.